second part of this second half of today's lecture, we talk about drugs and chemicals table. And so that's this example that I have here above. The drugs and chemical table is really very similar to the neoplasm table. It's found at the end of the alphabetical after your neoplasm table. So it has its own section as well. It's going to be identified in a table format. So I would go in here and I would look past the alphabetical and I would say, okay, where's my drugs and chemicals? There it is. And I'm going to read it just the same. This goes first by the drug or substance. So you have it in order by name. Sometimes that name may not match exactly, and that's okay. One resource you can use is the PDR.net. And this is something you'll learn about. You've probably learned in other classes. You will continue to learn about this. This is a website I highly recommend all coders should have. Put it in your computer somewhere, save it, memorize it. You will use this to look up anytime you talk about a drug to see what kind of drug it is. So in this case, our first one in our book on page 77 is for acetaminophen, which is heroin. And our characters are poisoning accidental, poisoning intentional, poisoning by assault, undetermined poisoning, adverse effect, and underdosing. And let's talk about that for a second. Poisoning accidental is any time that a patient does not intend to have an overdose of a drug, but they did, and they were not supposed to be taking it necessarily. So it's not something that was an adverse effect, or maybe they took too much of it. Okay, so they weren't supposed to take that much of it, or they weren't supposed to take it at all, really. And so they overdosed. Self-harm is they're trying to harm themselves, such as suicide. Assault, just as it sounds, somebody's trying to harm them, so somebody gave it to them and they weren't wanting it. It's undetermined. This may happen if a patient comes in and they've overdosed on something and they're unconscious. Maybe they passed away, or maybe they didn't give us any information. They may say they don't remember. In that case, poisoning would be undetermined. We don't know how they got poisoned, just that they were. And then our last two are adverse effect and underdosing. And these won't always have a code. In fact, the example that I have on the board, none of these had a code. So I'll take that out of our example here. And you can look at the table again on page 77 of your textbook to see that. Okay? And so for these ones, they had just simply a line. The reason for that is because you're not going to have an adverse effect or underdosing on a drug that is not typically taken. So acetone oils, we shouldn't be taking that. Acetomorphine, heroin, we shouldn't be taking that. So they're not going to have it as a prescription. They're taking it and they're overdosing. Okay, examples where an adverse effect would apply is if we gave them a medication and they immediately had a reaction, perhaps they were allergic. Examples of underdosing, especially with diabetic patients, maybe they didn't take their insulin, or a patient who was forgetful forgot to take their blood pressure medication. Those would be underdosing. And so there's all kinds of different scenarios where we're going to come here. Now in this table, it's going to read just the same as our neoplasm table did. We're going to find the drug and we're going to determine from the documentation what type of condition this was. Why were they being seen for this drug use? And in this case, this is not for drug use in terms of trying to get someone to stop using drugs. This is because there was a problem. So they overdosed or they underdosed. This is the only time you'll be in here. You'll find the drug. Let's say that they overdosed on heroin by accident. And we'll say it happened this morning. Accidental. They weren't trying to, they just happened to overdose. Okay, then we're going to determine that's poisoning accidental, acetaminophen, which we'll find from the PDR.net, and we'll look at that code. Now, you'll notice this code has an X in it. And if you remember from last week's discussion, when we looked at conventions, one of the things we looked at was what is a placeholder. And a placeholder is always denoted by an X. And basically it means that there's something in the code that needs to be described, such as a 7th or 6th character, but not everything that builds up to that is there. So in this case, a 5th digit character, which is where the X is sitting, would not apply to a drug overdose because that typically denotes location, and there's not really a location for that. So that X is always going to be listed in that category. And when we look at code T40.1X1, we'll notice there's no other .1X or 1B, it's just 1X. Okay, so we don't have to compare that 5th digit. In T40.1X1, which is the code that is recommended, it does specify poisoning by heroin, accidental or unintentional. And there's a notation for a 7th character. Okay, so just like we talked about earlier, anytime when you're looking in the tabular, it'll say a 7th digit character and it'll give examples at the beginning of the code. So the category is T40. You'll find under T40 the details for the 7th character. Sometimes you may have to go further back, and we'll talk about that when you actually get into ICD-10 CM coding more in that class, because that gets into some of the nitty-gritty. Just know that when you look up the code, always look first in the table, then the tabular, and then look for any additional notations. So in this case, we would say T40.1X, that's our placeholder, and then our last digit. So we said it was today, and if we looked at the 7th character options, that's for initial. So anytime we talk about initial, subsequent, sequela, we're looking at those 7th digit characters. That's all for today.